Welcome, everybody, to the Community Technical Assistance Center webinar series on family alignment. We're very excited to cover today's topic on caregiver engagement strategies. For those of you who have been with us on this ride around family alignment, we first started out in January, February, really kind of honing in on those first 30 days of services and talking through how to begin that collaboration with families early on and set a really solid foundation for our work with families together. So we spent 2 webinars really talking through what some of those strategies are around collecting information, providing information, collaborating, and engagement very briefly. And then we also had a consultation webinar a couple weeks back, really giving everybody an opportunity to kind of process any challenges that they have in implementing some of the strategies we provided in those webinars. So now, today, we're embarking on the second core component of our family alignment series, which is really focusing in on specific strategies about engagement. And today's webinar is really kind of looking at general engagement with caregivers in mental health services. And then we have a second webinar in a couple weeks, really attending to issues of child welfare involved families and engaging those caregivers. And then we'll also have a follow-up consultation webinar after that. So we're very excited to really spend some time with you. I'm here today with Caradina Sale, part of the CTAC resource team, longtime social worker. I'm here with Geraldine Burton, longtime family advocate as well, and myself, Lydia Franco, a social worker and part of CTAC resource team, and shortly we'll be joined by Jason Jones, also a social worker and part of the CTAC training team. So we're very excited to be here today to kind of embark on this discussion. I want to orient those in case you haven't been on one of our webinars before. On the right-hand side, you'll see a panel. There should be a chat box. If you don't see the chat box, there's a little chat icon on the top that you can press so that chat pops up. And everybody's currently muted because we expect quite a few people to join us. So please feel free to communicate with us in that chat box. Just make sure that before submitting that you pick on the drop-down, send to all panelists. That way we can see what your responses are, what your comments are, your feedback is. There will be a couple of times that we'll have a poll that will pop up. So we ask everybody to really just take a few seconds to participate in answering the poll. Or we may have some specific questions that we're going to ask to hear some feedback, just so that we can make sure to really align the content of the webinar with those of you who are with us today. So I'm going to start us off by passing it over to Caradina Sale, who will get started on the agenda.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I just want to go over with you our agenda today. We're going to do some introductions and welcome you like we're doing right now. We're going to talk about caregiver involvement. We're going to describe that process and why is it important. We're going to talk about the challenges of involving caregivers, both from the perspective of the caregiver as well as the provider. And then we're going to talk about building confidence and working with caregivers to really talk about specific strategies that you can use to really increase that engagement process with caregivers. And then, of course, questions and answers. I want to just let you know that when we do have a few polls, and when they pop up, they take over the screen. So you can utilize your dashboard up at the right to always go back to chat, so you can chat in any questions or concerns that you have. There's a blue little thought bubble. It'll be red when there are chats to look at, but you can always click on that to go back to the chat to chat in any questions. Okay? So we're going to start with a poll question. We just wanted to ask you, how often do you work with caregivers in treatment? So this is popping up right now. Would you say every time I have a child client, A, some of the time B, occasionally C, or D, not at all? We just want to check in to see how often you work with caregivers in treatment. As a reminder, these slides will be this recording will be posted on our CTAC website at www.ctacny.com. I'm just going to wait for those results to pop up. So it looks like most of you say that every time you have a child client, you engage caregivers and work with caregivers in treatment. That's wonderful. That's really good to hear. A few of you said some of the time, a few of you said occasionally, and very few said not at all. So with those of you that responded not at all, we'd love for you to think about this work and check in with you, or you can reach out to us as we continue the work together. So for those of you that said yes, how do you involve caregivers in treatment? What does this look like for you? So I'm going to ask you to use the chat box. Again, you can click on that chat bubble up at the top right and chat in the answer to us. So for those of you that said yes, how do you exactly involve caregivers in treatment? What does that look like? Do you bring the caregiver in the beginning of the session and the entire session? At the end, do you talk about your goals or what's happened in the past week? What does that process look like for you? Okay, thanks, Julie. Involving parents in the goal planning. Wonderful. Elizabeth says providing what they want to work on is when you'll bring them in. For younger kids, Michelle reported that caregivers are present for most of the session. For older children and adolescents, they may want that individual time. That's a really good point, Michelle. Thank you. And Pam says beginning and end typically is when you involve caregivers. Brett reports working in conjunction with the youth and caregivers throughout treatment. Melissa schedules collateral sessions. There are some joint sessions, schedule phone calls, and that treatment plan reviews. Great. Thank you, everyone. What a lot of participation. I really appreciate it. Bahi says try to involve them before the child is admitted to the RTF. So you're in an RTF, Bahi, and you try to involve the caregivers before the child is admitted. That makes a lot of sense. Sandy meets with caregivers in person weekly and then also has multiple phone calls throughout the week, it sounds like. So some of you have a range. So some of you work very intensely with caregivers and others of you not as intensely, and it sounds like it really does also depend on the age of the client. Great, thanks so much. So we just want to remind you, I know everyone here on this webinar knows what engagement is, but just to remind you how essential it is and the relationship from the moment a family is even considered for treatment, so the moment you get a phone call from someone as a referral or however you learn about the client, from that moment until they terminate or are discharged. Engagement is that most important component of really beginning a therapeutic alliance. It's about motivating and empowering participants to really understand, recognize their own resources, strengths, and needs, and to take that active role in changing their life and the life of their child. And so the goal of caregiver involvement, to really activate that participation. Activate that participation of the caregiver in the services between the child and family, but not only in the session, outside of the session as well, so that some of that change can happen in the session with you, but also in between session work is also really important.
So now that we are really kind of focused on caregiver involvement as the focus of treatment when working with kids, we also wanted just to highlight some key points about the importance of it. And I think this is, especially based on all the feedback that we just got, all the comments, this isn't necessarily something that's new to you, but I think it's important to kind of ground everybody on the same page. So that the parenting really plays an important role with kids, especially when we're working with kids, and that positive caregiver-child interaction is a vital protective factor, and that our job as providers is to really help build and support those protective factors for our child clients. I think what we can highlight is that, especially when we're talking about certain populations like kids with conduct problems, we know that it is incredibly critical to work with caregivers. We know that especially the kids with behavioral problems do not do very well, do not have significant improvement in child outcomes unless the family is involved in services, but not just marginally involved, but really deeply involved and really a part of the intervention. We know that youth who receive caregiver child interventions may improve more than those who receive individual child treatments, and I think this kind of makes sense. The idea is that we know kids don't really work don't function in a vacuum, don't function necessarily independently. As you're talking about older kids, it may look a little bit differently, but the vast majority of kids really function within this family environment. We know that there's a reciprocal effect between the youth and the family, and so the importance of really attending to that family context and making sure that it's included as part of the intervention is really critical in working with families. And another way to think about it is that we know that almost half of evidence-based treatments for youth really include caregivers in every session or in most sessions. So I think this is really important just to understand as a basic foundation in working with caregivers. So the question is really, what do we know about caregiver involvement? And I think, when we were preparing for this webinar, and we've done this kind of talk a few times, really wanted to kind of look at what the literature says around caregiver involvement. And for those of you who joined us in the webinars in the first 30 days, we also spent some time talking about differences in provider and caregiver perceptions around the services. So in the same sessions, you can ask a provider how that went, you can ask a caregiver how that went, and you may get two completely different responses. So we wanted to kind of see how are caregivers really being involved, and so many of you really kind of were able to illustrate how some important ways that you're involving caregivers in the service. In this one very large study, actually, which was particularly interesting, because what they did is they videotaped over 1,000 sessions, something like close to 200 kids, close to 100 therapists, and around a year and a half time. And what they did is they wanted to gather sort of the perspective of both the caregiver and the provider around what happened in session. And then what they did is they brought in independent observers and raters to look at all the videotape sessions. And what the independent observers found is that caregivers are oftentimes involved in the vast majority of the services, but it's how they're involved that oftentimes isn't necessarily what is reflected when we ask caregivers or providers what the perception is. So, for example, oftentimes they're involved in information gathering. So you can think of that really in the beginning. So in those first 30 days when you're doing assessments or evaluation, or when something's different or something changed and you want to gather information, that they're especially involved in those moments. Initially, when providing psychoeducation, you can see that the big part of the work that's being done with caregivers is just giving them some psychoeducation around the services or the illness, as well as some or orienting them really to the services. The other time is really around goal setting or reviewing treatment plans, essentially, right? So that we definitely need to kind of work with the caregiver around those times, both initially in those first 30 days, but as well as periodically and ongoing. And also when there were discussions around child external care, or the thinking there is really when you're talking about connecting kids with other services, referrals, use of other services. So what's interesting about this and what they have found, and has been found in other studies as well, is oftentimes when caregivers are involved, the definition of involvement varies greatly. But overall, it seems like the vast majority of sessions, caregivers are incorporated, but not at a deep level. There's a lot of breadth, but there's not a lot of depth in terms of the interventions and the work that's being done with the caregiver. So I can have collateral sessions just to check in and gather information, but the bulk of the treatment ends up happening with the youth alone. Or I will really just be able to connect with them periodically, or oftentimes what happens is the caregiver is left outside and the intervention is done with the child individually. The caregiver is brought in at the beginning or at the end. So those are sort of examples of breadth but not depth. And the idea here, and something we would like to ask you, is how are you incorporating them as part of the integral component of services? And we're going to spend some time in May on another webinar with some specific strategies about incorporating them in a little bit more depth. Today we want to focus on, well, if we want to involve caregivers, we first have to focus on engaging them, and how can we do that? And the important role of caregiver, as well as some challenges in really engaging caregivers and what that means for us in our day-to-day work. So we want to take a moment and just gather from you. You've been doing a great job of giving us feedback and commenting. Can you let us know what are some challenges that you've experienced involving caregivers in services? So if you can use that chat box on the right-hand side and submit and send to all panelists, and let us know what challenges have you experienced specifically in involving caregivers? I know many of you really spend quite a bit of time trying to engage caregivers. Okay, great. Some are coming in. Thank you. One challenge is and it's coming in pretty quickly. Some are talking about language barriers. Caregivers that want us to fix their child don't feel they need to make any changes. Caregivers will accept help for their children, but not for themselves. The mentality of my kids need help has nothing to do with my parenting is a perspective. Resistance, perception of resistance on the caregiver's part seems to be coming up quite often. Sometimes, though, and a separate kind of perspective is sometimes parents are wary of the services or the service providers. They have been left out or felt uncomfortable in the past. So that's an important point and maybe part of the reason as to why they may feel they may come across as resistant. Oftentimes attendance, transportation, work schedules are a challenge. Transportation, big issue. That seems to come up often. Parents who are unable to attend appointments, attend in quotes, meetings. So I guess that alludes to the fact that maybe there's another reason as to why they may not be coming. Parents not always eager to be involved or missing sessions. Parents who want medication only. Other comments coming in is when caregivers don't see any issues, distance and lack of transportation. Somebody also said that also caregiver mental health issues seems to come up often. So it seems to me that a lot of the challenges really focuses on really having challenges in engaging the caregiver, potentially understanding kind of where they're coming from, trying to interact with them, especially if you as a provider feel that they're not really engaging in the services for some reason, as well as some real concrete barriers. Transportation came up often, and I think that's always going to be an ongoing issue. So thank you for sharing those with us. I'm going to, Jerry Burton, our longtime family advocate, is also going to spend some time talking a little bit about what are some of the challenges that we know from the literature and from some of our work. Many of you have highlighted, but we're going to kind of summarize that a little bit just to give some more context.
Okay, again, thank you for chatting with us, and again, very, very common things that we hear from time to time. So I'm going to talk about attrition in children and child mental health, and I'm sure none of this is new to anyone, but we'll go over it anyway. So as you can see, there are alarming high no-show and attrition rates, 40 to 60%, even higher for most vulnerable families who face multiple barriers, 50 to 75%. And as we know, dropouts after 2 or 3 sessions are very common. And the rates of initial no-show and ongoing attrition, especially high for families seeking services for child conduct problems. Most inconsistent in treatment attendance, less likely to be retained. And also, attrition and low treatment dosage increase the likelihood of poor outcomes. Also, I think, which is not there, but I would venture to say that a lot of times there are issues with getting an appointment. We know that there most of the times are very long waiting lists, and that definitely can be an issue. A lot of times as the treatment progresses, it has been shown to be associated with parents feeling overwhelmed, experiencing multiple stressors, as well as family difficulties. And the highest levels of dropout occurred for families with higher levels of social difficulties and problems involving family dynamics. So these are just some of the things that attribute to attrition in child mental health. And here are just some barriers to engagement. Of course, there are practical barriers, which some people chatted about, time constraints, child care, transportation, of course, competing priorities, getting the kid there, and so forth and so on. And then there are perpetual barriers to engagement. And a lot of times that has to do with attitudes about mental health, and they can be also about, they can be influenced by prior negative experiences, culture, extent to which services match their expectations. Stigma is stronger predictors than practical through practical, what most likely addressed. And again, no, not all barriers are equal, so we need to remember that as well. And as you can see from our slide, there are any number of barriers. And again, I think, as always, I have to say we have to meet families where they are in the process. That is so very, very important.
So I just wanted to add a couple points to what Jerry was highlighting, and I think that what you see here is sort of the second bullet is perceptual, and there's some important things to highlight there. And one is the couple are treatment expectations, what those preferences are. Is there acceptability on the caregiver side, and is there a feeling of treatment match? Does the caregiver feel that treatment is relevant to their needs? Are we identifying and understanding what the family's felt needs are, and do the services that we provide align with those felt needs? We spent some time also talking about attitudes around mental health, negative prior experiences, because oftentimes if I've had a bad experience in a different setting, I may show up and assume it's going to be the same. So unless somebody takes the time to really orient me to the services, how this experience is going to be different from the ones I've had in the past, I'm going to come in with certain expectations. Challenges, poor provider family match, provider-caregiver match, and that really tends to the relationship, the helping relationship or the alliance in the relationship, and challenges in that where it isn't, where there's just a poor match, it's not working well, and oftentimes those are barriers. And those perceptual barriers I want to highlight really above and beyond some of the practical constraints like transportation and competing priorities, because the research clearly shows that perceptual barriers are oftentimes the things that really prevent people from coming. But it's also oftentimes the barriers that aren't talked about. So it's easier for me to say, well, I just couldn't make it, I didn't catch the bus on time, or I have another appointment, than for me to say, well, you know what, I just really don't like you as a provider, or I just don't really think this is helping, and those conversations are harder to say to somebody when I'm asked as to why I'm not coming, and it's much easier for me to say that there's other appointments. And oftentimes, above and beyond, the research has been pretty clear, is that if we can attend to some of those perceptual barriers, even if there are real transportation issues or other kind of practical constraints, that we can usually figure out ways to overcome those practical constraints. So attending to those perceptual barriers, and I think some of you alluded to them and some of your feedback, those issues are common and seem to be significant barriers, which also means we need to kind of spend some time talking about them. Cultural, we don't want to kind of always leave a cultural or race, ethnicity kind of issues to the side. Really attending to cultural competency, cultural sensitivity. Do we understand caregivers' traditions and beliefs and languages and life experiences, and what does that mean? Do we take that time to have those conversations? And I think oftentimes when families feel that that isn't being attended to, or it doesn't quite fit, the recommendations don't fit what they believe or understand from their personal experiences, from their cultural experience, then there's going to be a bit of a mismatch, and we find that to be a large barrier. And I think Jerry spent some time also talking about systemic barriers, and in particular those who are poverty impacted. Oftentimes we're talking about multiple issues, multiple trauma. We're talking about maybe experiences, not only the child experiences, but family experiences in dealing with a number of different issues, which I think oftentimes is usually the clients that we work with more than not. And that the reality of their lives oftentimes can get in the way of participating in traditional mental health services. So I just wanted to take a second to highlight a few of those important barriers that come up often. They come, and I want to say they also come up every single time we do these trainings as well. So we wanted to kind of, knowing what people's experiences are, including our own experiences as providers, knowing that the research also says that these are oftentimes big barriers for folks, we wanted to kind of take a look in terms of what is the caregiver perception in this process? What is their experience, and what does that mean? And there's been a couple studies, one in particular that really kind of took the time to look at the differences between providers and caregivers and how caregivers felt in participating in child treatment. And this one was specific to families who had kids with behavioral problems as well, which is one of the primary reasons as to why kids come to services. So I'm sure it's no news that for many of you, I'm sure there's a good chunk of your caseloads that are these kids with significant behavioral problems. And so caregivers were asked about their experience, what is their perception. These are some interesting quotes that were highlighted and really just highlights the theme of the experience that they had. So clinicians don't really care what you got to say. All they care about is what they got to tell you. I am totally uncomfortable because every time I say anything, I get blamed, and I'm tired of getting blamed. That is what is so frustrating. Sometimes clinicians already have an assessment, and it's killing me. Every day that I wake up, it is a constant struggle with my son, or it is a constant struggle with clinicians. It is very hard when the professionals don't listen or understand. And I'd be interested in hearing kind of your feedback. So I think we have a very interactive group here. So if you can kind of give us some feedback. What do you think? Do you think this is actually something that's common? So the literature is saying that these are common perceptions from caregivers and participating services. Now, it isn't I'm sure it's not every caregiver. I'm sure there are really great experiences that caregivers have, and I'm sure it's not everybody. It doesn't represent everybody, but that oftentimes this is something that comes up. So I would like to hear kind of your feedback. When you hear this, when you hear, they really don't care what we have to say as caregivers. All they care about is what they got to tell you. Or when you hear it's very hard when they don't listen or understand where we're coming from, what does that say to you? What does that mean? And does that actually, do you feel that that's actually something that's happening with caregivers you've worked with? How would you respond to that if you found out that that was actually how a caregiver felt? And I also want to highlight here is that this is tapping into not, it's hard to get to the appointment. I think this also really clearly highlights that the perceptual challenges of a sort of feeling that treatment isn't relevant, or the services don't quite fit, or they're not quite hearing where I'm coming from. I think these quotes also really highlight the importance of attending to perceptual challenges as well. And we have a couple that came in, so I think it's common for caregivers to think that, and we try to go out of our way to support parents. Yes, I hear that, or sometimes I just sense it from caregivers. So you may not have an outright conversation around it, but you can kind of get a feel that this is what they're experiencing. And that I think when parents do feel supported, they tend to attend more appointments. And I think that's an important point. Lisa in particular made that comment. And I think what the theme here is that the message from these quotes is really that oftentimes caregivers may feel blamed. If caregivers have low expectations for the services, it's not quite fitting, I'm not expecting much, or this is going nowhere. And if they don't really see any improvement or potential for improvement in outcomes, what tends to happen is that you respond in a certain way. And as a caregiver, I think what providers tend to see as resistance is oftentimes a caregiver who is feeling judged, is feeling blamed, has low expectations for treatment, and is seeing minimal positive outcomes. And I think it's important to kind of highlight some of those differences in thinking and processing. And when we use the word resistance, what does that really mean? And does it help, or does it get in the way of services?
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks for sharing the caregiver perspective. I think that really portrays some of those perceptual barriers that caregivers often come in with. I want to just take a minute and talk about how practitioners may feel. So you as a provider, how you may feel. And I just want to share with you that I started my career in a residential treatment center. And so I can relate in my time of direct service relating to all of these feelings. So from feeling reluctant and anxious, so uncertain of my role with the caregiver, uncertain around what the caregiver is able to do or can do or willing to do, concerned that, maybe the caregiver is the one responsible for the child that I'm working with, And being so green, really out of getting my degree and just starting to work with families, having a lack of confidence and knowledge, and that really came into play. Really feeling ambivalent, so concerned about, ambivalence around working with mom or dad or caregiver and working with the child, and not wanting to cause any conflict, for example, and ambivalent around how to really go about navigating those relationships, and sometimes avoiding the caregiver because, quite frankly, I was concerned about their own mental health, and I wasn't knowledgeable enough about how to bring the caregiver into care and help them receive help for their own needs. And also scared, so I experienced a lot of fear and concern about how the caregiver was going to respond to me, think of me, and then also compassion fatigue. So just having, a lot of exhaustion and feeling overwhelmed by the work. So these are really some of those practitioner barriers that I really invite you all to just think about as you continue to work with caregivers and how they may get in the way. Are there any others that you can think of? Are there any other barriers? What else gets in the way of really actively pursuing the engagement of caregivers? Can you chat in with me? What are some of those other barriers? So I know sometimes there's tension between the needs and what's required from you in the organization and what you're actually able to do. I know that that's sometimes a barrier.
So I just wanted to highlight some comments that are coming in, and there's one that just came in that says, it is a challenge for caregivers and providers because we all tend to steer away from the questions that could lead to conflict. Some providers don't follow their gut and ask the question, you didn't seem to respond well to that suggestion or comment. Oftentimes, the most effective way to engage and connect with others is to address the conflict with honesty and compassion. Great. Right? Others have said, good providers seem to have compassion fatigue. Mm-hmm. The poor providers seem to be all the others. So the idea being that there's oftentimes a lot of compassion fatigue. There's difficulty in having some of these conversations with caregivers. That oftentimes are us, many of you are kind of typing in that oftentimes our own biases or judgments kind of can get in the way. That sometimes the structural issues of not having enough time to kind of communicate with clients also gets into the way of that, and I think that's important to highlight. That oftentimes caregivers may not understand how therapy works, so it's our job to really try to orient them to those services and process some of that understanding. And not respecting the parent's thoughts on what's going on with identified child or not respecting the parent. That sometimes providers do think that they know what's best is another comment. A couple comments actually came in with that similar theme. Great, thank you. Please keep them coming. So we wanted to, and I think it's important because I think all those other kinds of comments, and it's interesting because when we first initially asked what are some core challenges, oftentimes the feedback is those concrete issues or some challenges in the relationship. And now when we're kind of asking, can we go in a little deeper? Can we think through what some of those other challenges are? Now we're going to get into the feedback is, well, it's really sort of those difficult conversations or how hard it is to actually do this work, or that, maybe we're all a little burnt out, or that the system gets in the way, but that it's important work, or maybe our own biases get in the way. And this is actually what I think we hope to encourage you. If there's one thing we're asking really coming out of this webinar is that we encourage everybody to take a minute to kind of think through a little bit, think critically about that engagement. So if there's a engagement that's not going well with the family, what is it? Is there something systemically? Is there something with the family? Is there something with me or the services that we're providing? Can we think a little bit more critically about what is going on? Because then we can identify core areas in which to attend to and enhance engagement.
And I really encourage anyone and everyone, if you haven't seen the last two webinars, to really review those in any spare time. I know you don't have any, but any time that you may have, because it really is helpful to think about that alignment perspective as well.
Yeah. And so what I wanted to highlight here is that oftentimes we can get trapped into sort of this culture of resistance. So if I am a caregiver, as was illustrated with some of those codes, who is feeling judged, blamed, I really don't think this is going to work, I don't think this is going to get anywhere, I'm going to come across a certain way. As a provider, I'm going to see that and I'm going to respond a certain way. We're all human, right? So this is really, you know, we talk about this in terms of, you know, that there's a process to this, that there's a process to therapy, but we're also people, and we oftentimes get triggered by things, or we oftentimes react to the way people react to us, and we get caught in this cycle of resistance. So where we then can continue to maybe incorporate our biases into the work, it's potential there that we may continue to blame. So it just keeps kind of perpetuating. But if we take a minute to kind of break that cycle and move it to more a culture of collaboration, and we spent a lot of time talking about the culture of collaboration in the first few webinars on the first 30 days, as Karen mentioned. And this is one example is, can we really kind of change the way we're communicating? Can we take some time to really get to know each other and build that motivation and commitment to work together, that each of us plays a different part in this process, and that we need to communicate and collaborate together to make this work. But that needs to be done a certain way, and there's certain key important strategies that caregivers need to do, providers need to do in order to ensure that families feel accepted, feel safe, and feel comfortable, and feel that this is actually something that will help their families. So we wanted to spend some time really thinking through building confidence in working with caregivers. I think sometimes a big part of that is also understanding where caregivers are coming from, and then what are some specific things we can do to attend to some of those issues.
Okay, so caregiver resilience. The key message from this slide that we want you to get is that parents will overcome challenges to help their child and strengthen their family. They do this on a daily basis. Our role is to understand where they're coming from and support them in this process. Because we know that families have a lot that they're dealing with. There's domestic violence, there's immigration, and there's a lot of stuff going on. But in all of that, families need to have support from natural support as well as support from providers as well. It's important that providers understand that. And again, I'm going back to, meeting families where they are in the process and in the journey and helping them to understand the treatment process and how to understand what's going on with their child, and working together in partnership and in collaboration. Until that happens, the treatment process will not be a positive one.
Yes, and I think just to highlight also is that the idea is that oftentimes there's this perception that caregivers will just kind of want to drop their kids off and have somebody else kind of take over. And maybe there is a little bit of a feeling of that. But oftentimes what I think we want to highlight, and what are some examples on this slide, and I want to highlight, there's quite a bit of work that was done by Dr. Susan Stern at the University of Toronto around engaging caregivers. And these are some of the things that she found, which I think is not news if you really kind of work alongside of families, is that despite all the different challenges, the adversity, all the different barriers that families experiences, is that caregivers really care and love their children and want to do the best they can by them. And they have, before they've gotten to you, they have overcome quite a bit, oftentimes, especially the families we work with, quite a bit of adversity. And so that it's important to kind of understand that caregivers really, that we have to kind of really come in with an assumption that caregivers love and care for their children, right. That our work with them is about helping to build resources and support, help kind of fill their toolbox with other tools, because maybe they didn't have the right tools, but that we're here working together, and that we can't negate the fact that these families oftentimes are struggling with a lot of things that we're probably not even aware of. Right. And I think that's really an important thing to highlight.
Yeah, I just want to point out a comment that somebody just chatted in, that providers sometimes want to accomplish way more than the family is actually able to handle, especially when families may be in crisis, and just trying to get through the day. I think that's a really important reminder. I'm really appreciating all these chats coming in. Thank you so much. We had another one that said, ask caregivers if they have support. Are they involved in family support? Many times we forget how alone families really feel.
Right.
So we wanted to just take a couple minutes and just kind of ask you to think through a little bit more critically some of these statements. So if a caregiver says, you know, for example, my husband disapproves seeking care, What do you think would make it hard for this caregiver to come to your agency? What might they like to hear? What do you think could help support them in seeking services? And how can we invite them into the services, which is a different way of thinking about this. Is how can we invite families to participate in our services? So, and that was just one example, but I think we can get feedback on all these. So if there's a caregiver that says, fix my kid, please. If there's a caregiver that says, well, my partner really disapproves. I'm not sure about this. Or I really had a bad past experiences, or I'm really overwhelmed right now. What are the messages that we as providers can provide to these caregivers as to invite them to the services so that they can come to the agency? And also, what do you think is going to get in the way for some of these families? So you can use that chat box on the right-hand side, and please keep the comments coming. I think this is wonderful.
I think Sandy pointed out that by the time we're involved with the families and they come to us, they're often at the end of their rope, and we can sometimes come across sounding very judgmental without even realizing it. Thank you. I think that's important to remember.
So some messages that are coming in is big we can help manage your time, provide support and advocacy, provide transportation to help manage some of that we can, and I'm assuming that's the one in terms of feeling overwhelmed, is how we can help provide you and to reduce some of that frustration. For the past experiences, ask what families liked and did not like about those past services so that we can prevent it from happening again. I'm looking at, there's quite a few coming in.
Helping families recognize their strengths and discussing ways to build off of those strengths and help them feel empowered and want to engage. And there was another chat earlier that said when we strengthen a caregiver, we also strengthen the child.
Right. And so there's a couple of you that are also kind of advocating being able to do home visits or house calls, and I think ideally that's also potentially where the system is going, is meeting families where they are as opposed to encouraging them to come to us all the time. Okay, so there's quite a few of you that really kind of have either figuring out ways to reduce those barriers, figuring out ways to have some of those conversations with them, and building some support. So thank you, everybody, for participating. Please make sure to keep submitting some of those feedback or any additional ideas or strategies that you have. So I just wanted to highlight here that the desired outcome of early interactions is that the caregiver develops motivation by experiencing a sense of support for the current emotions and concerns, a sense of hope that problems can change, and a belief that the worker and treatment can help promote the desired change. And I think those are really sort of the goals. At the end of every appointment with a caregiver, are you sure that these are the messages that you're communicating and that the caregiver is experiencing? And we spent quite a bit of time in the first series of webinars to also say sometimes we also have to create a culture of feedback and get continuous feedback from families at the end of every session to ensure that we are actually communicating what we think we're communicating.
Okay, everyone, we're going to do a little role play. This is Kara here, and I'm playing the role of therapist. I am going to be meeting with Jerry and Jason. Jerry is the mother of Jason. This is an old photo that they gave the clinic of them from several years ago. So Jerry and Jason are attending their third session in the clinic, only to find out that they have a new therapist, and that's me. They did have if you were able to participate in our other webinars, you saw that Jerry and Jason had Miss Yvette as their therapist, and now it's Miss Kara. So we're going to start with this, and we would love your feedback after the role play. So I'm going to go get Jerry and Jason, and I'll be right back so you can listen in. Okay, welcome. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Jerry.
Hi.
Hi, Jason. So nice to meet you. So I introduced myself in the waiting room, but I just want to introduce myself again. My name is Kara, and I'm going to be your new therapist.
Where's Miss Yvette?
Yeah, Miss Yvette is no longer with us. I'm so sorry to tell you that.
Oh.
And I'm sure she really misses you, and I'm sorry that you didn't know she wasn't going to be here.
No, we did not know at all.
Yeah, I didn't think you did. But I'm going to be taking over Miss Yvette's place, and I know in a lot of ways I can't take over her place because I'm sure she was she's irreplaceable.
but I'm going to be your new therapist. Is that okay?
Well, you know, we were really having great sessions with Miss Yvette, so, you know, if that's the way it has to be, I guess we'll have to deal with it, but we really wanted Miss Yvette to work with us, and so, you know, but I'm really disappointed that we didn't know this prior to today.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine, and I really apologize. I really apologize. Maybe we can talk today and think about creating a relationship and figuring out ways that I can help you, and then you can think about it.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
You seem like a nice lady.
Thank you. You guys seem very nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really look forward to working with you. I've worked with lots of kids and families, and so I'm hopeful that I can help you, and I think you're in the right place, and I'm really excited about the work that we can do together. I want to just start there and understand what brought you here. So I know you had a few sessions with Miss Yvette, and you were excited to work with her, and hopefully we can continue in the same way. But what really brought you here today and into the clinic?
Miss Yvette didn't share any of that information with you. You know, that's one of the things about, you know, when you're coming into these places, you have to retell your story over and over and over again, and it's just, I feel like sometimes I need to have a tape recorder where I can just press the play button and just, so I won't have to tell it over and over again. So, I mean, you know.
I get it. I get it. You know, and I do have your information on paper, and I've read through. And so
why did you ask me
Because
that?
it's important for me to hear from you. So I understand that, Jason, you're having some difficulty in school, perhaps.
The teacher doesn't like me. She says that I act up in class, but I don't think that's the case. I don't do that.
Okay. And that's what brought you here. Was having some difficulty.
Yeah, because he doesn't do that at home. Okay. Not at all. And he's a very intelligent young man as well.
Great. I can tell.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Are there any thoughts about, me being here?
Well,
any
you
other
do
concerns?
work here, but again, like I said, you're not Miss Yvette.
Mom, why are you acting like that? She's trying to help us.
What do you mean? She and I are having this conversation, so you need to kind of just relax.
Okay.
And what do you think is so different about me and Miss Yvette?
Well, for one, I'm not sure that you're going to really understand our family dynamic.
And why would that be?
Well, for one, I mean, you're white.
Yeah, I am.
You know. I'm a little concerned about that.
You are. I so appreciate you telling me that. Because I am white and you all are African American, and so you may feel that we're very different in a lot of ways, and I may not understand you and understand your family and your dynamics. But I think Ms. Yvette and I have something in common, that we care about you, that we want to help you. But I'd like to keep talking about this because I think it's important. I really don't want it to get in the way.
Well, can I ask you a question? Do you have children?
I do.
Okay.
I have 2 sons.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah. So thank you, and I really hope that we can continue to have a kind of open relationship, that anything that's on your mind, any concerns that you have around the work with Jason and you, that you will talk to me about that anytime that it comes up, because I think it's really important that as we begin to get to know each other, that we're really honest with each other. How's that sound?
That sounds very good.
Yeah. Okay. So I really look forward. We're going to continue. We're going to say goodbye to each other, and then we'll chat in next week. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. We really sped up that process, but we wanted to make sure that we were able to give you the rest of the content of the webinar. But just wanted to give you a little peek into a session with Jerry and Jason, and I'd like to get your feedback. What did you think about that? If you use that kind of chat box, and what are your sort of impressions of that? Do you have any other suggestions? Have you had similar experiences, and then how did you handle them successfully? So we have some folks that are coming in that says, that taking the time to recognize that the change is difficult was really wonderful. And that oftentimes that's also where the breakdown begins, is in sort of these handoffs and not having the full backstory.
Yeah, we chose this scenario on purpose because this has happened to me as a therapist. It's happened to other people in organizations, and it's not intentional often. You know, sometimes something happens in someone's life and they can't come back to work or whatever it is. But this relationship building is so crucial at every step of the way.
Yeah, and so everybody really highlighted that it was very clear from the role play that Jerry did not want to have to retell her story again. Yeah. And that oftentimes that becomes a real hurdle, and it's a real issue, but oftentimes we end up getting stuck in these handoffs that don't go so well, and then we have to start over again. So being mindful then that is a potential area of breakdown is important, and then how can we do it so that the process goes a little bit smoother the next time around. And others appreciated really attending to the issues of race. And somebody made a point, and I also wanted to kind of reiterate that and we didn't get a chance to role play it out all the different ways, but one next step is, well, can we just kind of contract to have one more visit? Right. So being that, you know, Jerry wasn't sure about the service at this point, Kara was really kind of trying to orient her to the services, but, you know, she has a right to be able to say, well, I don't know if this is going to work.
Yes, absolutely.
And so can we just contract with one more service? How does that sound? Is that okay with both of them? I think is an important discussion to have and an important choice to give families. Yeah. So, and some of you also replied that too. So thank you so much for focusing in on that. And that was wonderful. And please keep submitting those comments and feedback.
So just want to review some of the goals of that very first contact or appointment. Is really understanding the needs. So I did want to understand from Jerry and Jason why they were in the session. Why did they come to the clinic? Really increasing the caregiver and the child's investment in their efficacy, and identifying attitudes about previous experiences with other mental health services or any other services in institutions. So that's one thing I didn't get to do in the role play that I really wanted to do, and if I would have had an hour to show you, I would have done all that. But most importantly, problem solve around not only those concrete barriers, which we didn't get into really, but the perceptual barriers we did around culture and race. So really attending to some of those barriers and problem solving and working with families and giving them the choice. I think I really appreciate that you said that, Lydia, giving them the choice. So maybe it wasn't going to work out between us, and that's okay that they have that choice.
So the successful process of involving caregivers, I mean, we know that that's very, very important. And from the role play, a lot of this was definitely done. And it begins with caregivers feeling respected and heard. Very, very important. Reflective listening and validate the parent's experience. You know, for example, if the parent didn't feel that this was going to work out, and it could be because of past experiences that they'd had with a mental health clinic, then, you know, just being able to hear that and validate it and, you know, kind of come up with some strategies as how to deal with that. Yeah. Acknowledging the struggle and recognize strengths, and that is so very, very important. Use reframing liberally to decrease blame and sense of failure and hopelessness. Change the self-blame to regret. That is extremely important as well, because a lot of times if that doesn't happen, again, that's going to maybe more than likely turn the parent or caregiver off, and they may not come back for treatment. And so those things are really, really important. Clarifying goals and needs, seek feedback on the match between the caregiver expectations and services, prioritize, help keep focus, and align treatment as issues arise in the work. And we know that there will be issues that will arise. Transparency in your evaluations, identify barriers and concerns, collaboratively problem solve, discuss options and ideas. What does the parent think may help? Really, really important. Get their feedback. What has worked before? Instilling hope. Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. You know, for me, it's really important to instill hope at every interaction, because I am aware that sometimes caregivers are so run down and so overwhelmed and not doing well in whatever way we can think of. But I think instilling hope, and so I wanted to remind Jerry that she was in the right place, and I was hoping to really help her. And I think tapping into those hopes and dreams as we continue the work together is really, really important.
Absolutely. So use motivational interviewing strategies to respond to ambivalence, increase intention to participate. Again, all of these are very, very important. Respect and incorporate caregiver perspective in the treatment plan. Empower caregivers and foster self-efficacy, and thank caregivers for attending, as without their participation, the child's progress may be limited. And we know that is very, very true.
Great. So I think this is a great kind of summary slide, and feel free to print this out. So you'll be able to access the slides in the recording from ctechny.com. I would kind of print this out, maybe put it by my computer, my desk, or wherever it is that I meet families, carry it with me, because I think it's an important kind of good summary slide, a quick reference guide for key important strategies. And as you can see, there isn't anything so different or out of the box. These are all things that we essentially kind of learned as we went along or in school: reflective listening techniques, motivational techniques, reframing techniques, and really just incorporating that empathy and the respect for caregivers is particularly important. I wanted to just to highlight one comment. Terry in particular has really kind of focused on the importance of these handoffs, and then when we switch services, how it really does a disservice to families, and how can we think that through so we don't continue to do that for them. So thank you, Terry, for highlighting that. I just wanted to highlight, I think this is also a good summary slide because it highlights, this was a study done around therapeutic alliance and key therapist attributes that help support a positive therapeutic alliance. And I think that there's some personal attributes like being flexible, honest, respectful, confident, interested, friendly, warm is particularly helpful, but that also highlighted some key techniques that go along with those personal attributes, like being reflective and supportive, and affirming and understanding, and that all those are key personal attributes and techniques that can be utilized. Jerry spent some time really kind of highlighting some of these. These are some additional slides that you have that can go into a little bit more detail. Jerry, did you want to add something else around strategies to engage and empower families?
Well, the only one I would think is where it says take time to understand the family's perspective. Families may have concerns about privacy and confidentiality. Those who do not trust the provider or feel the information shared will not be held in confidence and are also at a greater risk for dropout. I think that is really, really important. And again, the cultural and racial differences between the provider and the family can lead to misunderstanding. If that exchange I had with Kara, that really could have turned into something a lot different, and it may not have been, in fact, I know it wouldn't have been very positive. It would have been very negative. So again, I think just the fact that she validated my feelings and was really open to having that discussion was excellent, you know, and again, these are subjects sometimes folks don't want to, you know, talk about, you know, but we have to sometimes get out of that comfort zone, and if we really want to be able to work with families in a positive partnership, collaborative, strength-based way, these are the things that we have to do sometimes. So.
And then what we have here is just another, really, you know, there's a slide here, but I think we spent some time talking about it already. Attending to past experiences is really crucial, and spending some time talking about that. So Kara could have also talked a little bit about the past experience with the previous provider, and did it go well, did it not go well? And that one sounded like it was going well. However, maybe it hadn't been going well. How can we process that and just kind of regroup, restart, and really kind of think through how to do things a little differently is particularly important.
And understanding that it affects your relationship, the current relationship, this past experience.
It creates a foundation, right? So it could be a rocky foundation or it could be a strong foundation, depending on how you approach that. And that lastly, and I think this is something that both of you displayed in the role play as well, was creating an opportunity for the families, the set participants, the families to ask questions. So how can we develop that culture of feedback so that they do feel comfortable sharing how they feel, what they think, what the responses are. If they think something's not going well, being able to have those conversations is critical in this process. But sometimes you have to kind of create that environment in which people feel comfortable having those conversations. A couple last points. Validation is really, you know, Jerry spent some time already talking about this, but I think validation is oftentimes something that is rarely used. or rarely used in a way that is most appropriate. And it's more than like, oh, that's great, thanks for trying. It's really kind of relating an understanding, relating that empathy through validation. Really kind of expressing that even if you don't agree or even if something didn't go so well, that the behaviors, the decisions are made are justifiable, so that doesn't necessarily mean you're saying that they are an adaptive approach or an appropriate approach, but that you can understand how decisions were made, you can understand where people came from. So here are some kind of important examples. If we focus on being strength-based in our comments, that we can really build that therapist-parent relationship. So for example, you have set some really good house rules. Or you can also reframe, like it is obvious that you yell at your son because you care a great deal about his being successful and happy in school. And those are just key messages. It doesn't necessarily mean you agree with the yelling, but it means that you understand where they're coming from, why it happened, and now how can we talk through some other strategies to help support you so it doesn't get so overwhelming or frustrating. So validation and being able to do that consistently at every opportunity is particularly helpful.
And lastly, I think a really good way to summarize all of this is to think about these ARCH principles. From Joseph Matucci created these. And to summarize, the A is for acceptance, the R is for respect, the C is for curiosity, and the H is for honesty. As Lydia said, this is another one of those slides where you could just print out and hang around you to remember these principles in every interaction with caregivers and families.
So I just wanted to highlight that the slides and the recording are all available on the ctacny.com website. And I think we've had a number of different comments and feedback, and we've been trying to attend to some of those questions as they came up. We also will have a consultation webinar, which will be really Q&A opportunity. So we want you to kind of take a minute to kind of think through some of the strategies that we've highlighted. Also at our next webinar on March 18th, the Child Welfare Organizing Project is going to talk about engaging child welfare involved families. So please take the time to register for that or check your email for our announcements. And then a consultation webinar April 15th. So the idea of the consultation webinar is to be able to kind of process what some of these challenges are for you. Maybe you can try to implement some of the strategies that we've highlighted and see how it goes. And then you can have an opportunity with us to talk through some of those things. And a CWOP representative will also be available for that consultation. So with that, I wanted to just highlight our emails. Feel free to reach out to us, ctacny.com. Cara Dean Sale, Geraldine Burton, Lydia Franco, and you can go to ctacny.com to access the slides, recordings, and any handouts, as well as all the previous recordings and webinars from the first part of this Family Alignment series. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time today to be on this webinar with us, and I wanted to give a special thanks to Dr. Susan Stern for sharing with us a lot of her research and information, which I think is going to be very helpful for everybody. Thank you, and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.